Living in the Dharma.
So the way I wanted to talk about teaching this time, I've talked about it many times, is what I've been feeling more and more struck by, and I think needs to be brought out more and more, is the fact that everything we do at a Buddhist centre, the centre of everything for us is ordination. Really, you could say the centre of everything for us is our public ordination. That's when we're ordained. You're not ordained at your private ordination. It's your public preceptor who ordains you. And the public ordination itself is at the heart of everything we do, really. If we were Catholics, it would be our Holy of Holies. It's our sacrament in a certain sort of way. It's the centre of everything we do. Everything before that leads to ordination, and everything after that expresses ordination. The reason I wanted to really emphasise that is that really everything comes down to that, to our ordination. Most of you here have been ordained. Some of you have just received your invite. One of you has just received your invite, and the others are well on the way. But ordination is the keystone of everything in our movement. It either goes to that or it expresses that. And everything that we're going to do on this Teachers' Week really arises from that fact, from the fact of our ordination. It's the basis of that, even if you're not ordained yet. It's because of ordination that you're teaching at all in our centre. And it's because you're ordained that you're teaching afterwards. The first thing it does, you see, as soon as I remind us, and it's weird, isn't it, but we do need to remember, partly our order and movement is its tendency is towards being casual in a certain sort of way, unbuttoned, in other words, a spirit of friendship. But therefore it's easy to forget that we do have I want a very religious language, a sacrament. I'm using those words obviously highly metaphorically. We have a heart of what we're doing, which is mystical, to do with our relationship with reality, which is of the profoundest significance. You may not feel it to be in the moment of being ordained, if you've been ordained. I remember at my private ordination, I was just very nervous, that's all I remember, getting the words wrong. And then when I took my yidam, I remember saying, Pamasamvara, I think. And then Sivadra said, you think? And I said, yes, I'm sure. And then the next day I thought, I'm not sure, I'm really not sure. So I just remember being nervous. I remember my public ordination. I remember the person being ordained next to me booming out the puja too loudly, and I'm getting irritated with him. So whatever you remember of the actual event, that's not so important. The actual event, what the meaning of ordination is, going on deep below the level of consciousness. Something in that ceremony, private and public, changes something about ourselves, orientates us toward the Buddha Dharma in a way that I think my own instinct at the moment is that even if one resigns, something is irrevocable about that moment. The ordination is it's the profoundest moment, really. And that's why all sorts of things arise from that, why it's really, really crucial that we use our name, for instance, our order name, that we don't shorten it and don't allow other people to shorten it. Why it's really crucial that we wear our kesa when we teach, because the kesa is an outward manifestation, the visible sign of ordination, just as our name is it's really important that we don't talk about our ordination in a flippant way, that we treat our kesa with great reverence, we never put it on the floor, that we never let people play with it, or everything that we're doing. The reason why this very building exists as the London Buddhist Centre is because of ordination. Yeah. So I think everything about teaching actually arises from that fact that we've either asked to be ordained or we are ordained and expressing that our ordination. One thing it says immediately is that we're only using this word teacher in a very sort of metaphoric, merely because we need a word way. I've heard lots of people say they want another word. That's actually not very important, I don't think. It's fine to call people I'm teaching the Dharma. No problem with that. As long as we remember that word teaching is a shorthand for something that you can't really say to people without doing a talk like this and without trying to live this life. Yeah, as long as we remember it's a shorthand. The trouble is, if you try and create some better word for it, you end up drawing more attention to it in a certain sort of way. It's a shorthand for something much, much deeper that you can't really express. So for instance, somebody I invited for next year's teaching week and said, tell me why you'd like to do it. He wrote and said, well, I've taught maths at university level and so on. And I was really struck by that as if, because I'm using the word teacher, his instinct was to tell me what teaching he'd done. Do you see what I mean? And for me, it was almost as relevant as saying I've done snowboarding or I'm a massage therapist. You know what I mean? It's the wrong metaphor. I don't mean it in that way. And that will become more obvious as we go through the week. So the word teacher is just being used as a shorthand for something you can't really communicate. I can say something else about that. So that's one thing it shows immediately, that it's to do with our ordination. It's not to do with being a teacher in the way we tend to think of it. Although it includes some of those elements. I've just forgotten something I was going to say more about that, but let's leave that for a moment. It also, I hope, makes clear that you're teaching a particular Dharma in a particular context. Yeah. So when we say our ordination, we mean our Dharmacharini ordination. Actually, I think Sagramati is wanting us to change it to a Dharmacharin ordination as the collective noun for, and we need a collective noun. I've been thinking more and more in terms of the Dharmacharya, that is the heart of our movement, is the Dharmacharya, but that heart of Dharmacharya is resting on our ordination. Yeah. So that Dharmacharin ordination, our Dharmacharya, our very concept of that, is Bhante's concept. Yeah. Our ordination is Bhante's ordination. It's based on his understanding of the Buddhist tradition, and that when we're ordained, whether it's by Bhante or by people ordained by Bhante, we're saying we share in his understanding. Yeah. So we might share, like I share in my private and public preceptors understanding ordination, which is Suvajra and Subhuti, who share Bhante's understanding. Maitreyabandhu, who I ordained, shares my understanding, hopefully, of our tradition, and that's shared by Subhuti and Suvajra, which is shared from Bhante. Yeah? And that's what our lineage is. More and more, we're actually becoming a lineage, because we have teachers. We have our great teacher, Bhante Sangharakshita, our founder and visionary. His disciples share his understanding, our disciples share, and so on. And that's what our tradition is. And through the many, many, many years, that's where it'll go. It'll be a sharing of understanding. Any sharing of understanding has many, many elements, which you can never reduce that to a syllabus, for instance. It's primarily sharing an undefinable spirit, but it's also sharing understandings, views, language, common symbolic signposts like becoming a mitra and so on, mitra study, common structural elements like single sex. The single sex practice of our movement is part of our structure. That's how you train to be ordained, for instance. It's part of our structure. It's not an add-on. You see, to me, it's a structural thing, just as centres are a structural part of our movement. And what we mean by a centre, or mitra study, the mitra study course is part of the structure of our movement. So sharing that understanding with your teachers, and their teachers teach you up to Bhante, is sharing an understanding of those structures, sharing an understanding of the inspiration, sharing an understanding of language, and so on. Now, of course, I'm saying this very much understanding that there's been a lot of discussion around all this in the order, particularly. I remember an order member said, I want to be a Buddhist, I don't want to be a Bhanteist. So I said, what were you particularly thinking about when you say, I want to be a Buddhist? And he said, the positive precepts. So that, they're Bhante. You won't find them explicitly in the Pali. Yeah? So often we don't realise how much we're sharing Bhante's vision. Yeah? I think one of the issues with Bhante's vision is that we need to study it more. Slightly disappeared from our corpus. And in a way, sort of intentionally, because we wanted to make sure we were studying the tradition more fully. Ratnaguna, I remember talking about that. But we also need to make sure we're studying Bhante. The difficulty with studying Bhante is he said lots of different things in lots of different contexts. The seminars are really crucial, I think, for Bhante, for understanding Bhante, because that's where he's done a lot of his imagining of what we're doing. Because it's anything that we calling teaching is resting on our ordination, because ordination is the keystone to everything we're doing, that places Bhante very much in the centre of that, so that we're teaching from a shared understanding, which is his understanding. As I say, that shared understanding is cultural, but it's also to do with a face-to-face meeting. I don't think you can share that on Facebook very easily. There may be ways, but there are problems with our online way of sharing things. It's mostly to do with this kind of gathering. You share by being together, really. It's only metaphorically that you share when you share things on Facebook. So it also shows, doesn't it, that if we think of it as everything is based on ordination, then when I come down on a Wednesday night to teach mindfulness of breathing or metta bhavana to what we call newcomers, which again, we have to be careful with words like newcomers, as if they're, sometimes I've heard people talk about newcomers as if they're children that you mustn't say anything to. They may be new to the Buddhist centre, but they're not new to life usually. Some of them have seen really quite a lot of that underneath, So they're not newcomers in a particular way. I mean, the Buddha, for instance, taught anyone who he came into contact with. He didn't think, you're a newcomer. I'm really more teaching order members at the moment. The Buddha didn't have those distinctions, did he? He didn't ever. There's no sense of the Buddha ever teaching newcomers. Actually, in our language, he did. Most of the people he taught that we come down to us are newcomers. But when you think of it like that, it just shows you that all of our terms you have to be quite careful with. People come to us, in my experience, with serious questions, with serious issues about a serious life. They're not newcomers in the way that word can start to suggest. Yeah. But it shows you that if ordination is the key to what we're doing, our private and public ordination, then when I'm doing that, teaching newcomers, I'm trying to basically invite you into the spiritual community. Right from the word go. I don't have that in my mind. I don't go down and think, who can I get in the spiritual community today? But I'm not teaching a set of practices. I'm not teaching a set of techniques, valuable their practice and teachings and techniques are. I'm trying to say, and it's not conscious in my mind, I'm trying to say, golly, we're in a really, life is unfathomable, quite often difficult. how does one live it in the best possible way? I believe that the Buddha lives it in the best possible way, and that Bhante's understanding of that is the best I've come across. I want to share that with you. Now, at the moment, what I'm wanting to do is getting you to sit down and relax a bit, because you've been looking at a screen all day, and I'm going to teach you to watch your breath. But somewhere, that's not really what I'm doing. Yeah? So what strikes me is that every time I'm teaching, I'm always thinking, actually tell you what I think the best response to this difficult, wonderful life is to join an order, a religious order, and a Buddhist order, and this order. That's what I really think. But I never say that, and I don't, in a certain sense, think that. It's part of my DNA now. So really, I'm right from the beginning saying, why don't you get ordained? But I never say that. Yeah? But, as soon as someone asks me a question, that's in my mind where it always leads. I was really struck recently, I was on the college meeting, came back from the college meeting, and I came back on a Wednesday afternoon, and I was teaching Maitreyabandhu here in the small shrine room to newcomers. And it really struck me. I was teaching, because one of the great things about teaching is you teach, and you're really always teaching yourself. And crikey, Maitreyabandhu and mindfulness of breathing, that about covers it. You teach, and if you're not careful, you can get very eloquent teaching. And, the fourth stage of the Maitreyabandhu, the final stage of the Maitreyabandhu, are you living like that? Is your participation on Facebook an expression of that? So much just is teaching that first, those 5 stages of mindfulness of breathing. Do you live up to that? And the answer is inevitably no. And there should always be, I think, a sort of shaming element of teaching. I don't mean shamed publicly. I mean that your own shortcomings are brought clearer into perspective. I think this is one of the reasons why anyone teaching should be in a Going for Refuge group or a chapter, so they can confess the distance between what they can teach and who they are. If you can't do that, you start to get seduced by your own sophistication. It's a really great danger of teaching. You start to think you're really rather special because everyone's looking up to you and adoring you. Only your friends know what you're like. Yeah? So that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important. You see, and all this comes from being ordained, that you have a chapter where you can go and say, I was teaching the Maitreyabandhu on Wednesday, I taught it really well, but then on Thursday I was reacting to somebody in a conversation and being heavy-handed. I need to really confess not only that reaction, but that distance between what I can say and what I can teach. And that distance is, I find, quite painful, sometimes very painful. I remember at the end of classes when I used to teach the Sanganite, wanting to make offerings at the end of the class, they would just apologise, too slight a word, but to confess the difference between what I can say and what I could teach. So when you're teaching, there's a new level there's a new pratimoksha, there's a new discipline of training, which is that feeling of shame between the things that you can teach and how much you're practicing what you can teach. And that's very, very important, that feeling of shame. And Vandana Jyoti was talking to me a while ago saying, how she can find it uncomfortable teaching in the centre. And I was thinking that's very good. That's a very good sign. Only the Buddha really can teach the Dharma. He's the only one who's qualified to teach the Dharma. So one jolly well should feel a bit uncomfortable. There's been lots of discussion about Bhante and his lack of perfection. But, of course, he's not perfect because he's not the Buddha. After the Buddha teaching the Dharma, you've got all kinds of issues of imperfection, if that word is correct, because I think perfection is a Christian word. I can't think of any Buddhist word that's valuably translated like that, but Radhaguna would probably be able to.
Sorry, I was taking notes. I didn't listen to your last bit.
Is there a Buddhist word for perfection? I think it's a Christian concept.
Perfection?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think there is one.
Yeah. So I think if we're not careful, we've still got this idea of a perfection and a perfection in a teacher. Now there are issues with Bhante, as we all know, and I'm not going to go into those, but your teaching is on the basis of your shared understanding with him. If it's not, you shouldn't be teaching. Yeah. At least not teaching in a Tree Ratna Buddhist centre and not teaching with your kesa on, because I don't know why you're teaching. I don't know on what basis you're teaching, unless it is because you've asked for ordination and you've not been ordained yet. So do you see how, if you think about arising for ordination like that, I think it makes it much, much clearer what you're doing. It means that you're confessing and so on. It also means that the technicalities of teaching may or may not apply. I've seen teachers who I think are very good teachers, but frankly I couldn't help them. I just sort of think there are issues with it, but like for instance Dave Mitchell is a very, very good teacher in particular ways. And I remember recently I watched him give a class and he was clearly trying to do some of the things I was saying he should be doing. And he just couldn't do them. Sorry about this. It just wasn't his, didn't fit him. And he didn't quite know why he was trying to do them, and I thought that was obvious. Actually, he's a very good particular kind of teacher, but in other ways he's not so good. And that'll be true for all of us, for me included. Yeah. And that's fine because you're expressing your ordination. The other thing it shows that it's based on ordination is that it's actually one of the reasons why Bhante never wanted Mitras to teach. We've got a kind of controlled way of doing that here at the centre, and many centres need to do that now. But the reason he didn't want that to happen was because for him, the most important thing about what we call a meditation class, all of these things in our mind should all have inverted commas around them, is that you meet someone, you meet a member of the spiritual community. For Bhante, that's the most important thing. Not the mindfulness of breathing, not the Maitreyabandhu, not a Mitra study group, but that you're meeting somebody in the spiritual community. That's why he always wanted order members to teach. And he said if you try and expand by using mitras, it's not a real expansion. I think there is actually a value in having mitras teaching, notwithstanding that, but it needs to be clearly part of an articulated approach to what we're doing. And those mitras teaching need to be clearly sharing that understanding of our tradition, even if they're still training in that. So yes, you see that if we think of it as our ordination, everything that we're so-called teaching in our so-called classes for so-called newcomers is all an expression of the fact that we've gone for refuge to the three jewels in that holy of holies of our private and our public ordination, which we can never fully express why we did that. The more good reason you have for doing that, usually the less valid it is. You can never fully express why that's important. I'm always want to come back to that wonderful statement Bhante says, where he says, there is something about the movement, the order, and even about me that is not easily definable. There is a touch of something that cannot be buttoned down, something that cannot in the end be defined. Even the desire to button it down or define it is a mistake. That was a mistake that the Theravada made in connection with its Vinaya. Everyone will need to take care of that rather mysterious, indefinable spirit that gives the movement life and energy. So I think it's really important to bear that in mind, that our ordination is mysterious and indefinable, and that everyone will need to take care of that rather mysterious, indefinable spirit that gives the movement life and energy. So everything we're doing comes from that ordination. And everything we're doing is drawing people towards that. And of course, part of that drawing people towards that is complete freedom, which means freedom not to be drawn towards that. There should never be any pressure on people to do that, because then they're not free. If they're not free, they can't decide to do that. That itself is part of our vision and culture, that you're free to come and you're free to go. And if you go, I won't ring you up and say, where were you? You're free to come and you're free to go. And that's the Buddha's attitude. He teaches people. Some people get it and become a disciple. Some people don't. And they're free to go. That's, part of our culture. But the other way to think of it is that not the other way to think, but carrying on this basic thought that everything really comes back to our ordination, even if we haven't been ordained yet, is that teaching is our primary way of expressing the ordination vows. And remember, I'm using this word teaching at the moment very, very loosely. I don't mean sitting in front of a class. I mean any situation in which you're communicating what being an order member is. So, for instance, on the occasions that I give poetry readings, I wear my kesa. I'm published as a poet with my Buddhist name, and that for me is a teaching situation. You see what I mean? I found wearing my kesa in those situations, I can say more, not less, than I could without my kesa. Yeah. A school visit, a chat with somebody on the bus when you have to introduce your name, having coffee with a friend. All of those I'm including in this word teaching, which of course stretches it far too far. By all of that being an expression of our ordination, of course the primary expression of that is friendship, is Kalyana Mitrata. Friendship in Kalyana Mitrata is a primary expression of altruism of our order. So when we take those great ordination vows, for the benefit of all beings, being one of them, our primary way of expressing that is through friendship. Yeah. It doesn't sound like it's a world-changing event, that. It's definitely not through opinionating through Facebook or on online media. It's through making friends. Yeah. That's what people need. There isn't such a thing as a world separate to people. I've been struck more and more by the metaphor of the world. I remember a friend of mine saying, I want to change the world. And the problem with that metaphor, it's always distant, isn't it? When people say, I want to change the world, it never sounds like anyone, it doesn't include me sometimes. It doesn't seem to include anybody I know. It's a distant metaphor. And therefore, you have to be aware like any metaphor, you have to be aware of the confusions that any metaphor creates, because it's got a side that it's trying to communicate, and it's got what happens if you take it literally. I've even known people try to sort of get past me because they're trying to change the world. You know what I mean? It's like they try to, if you're not careful with that metaphor of changing the world, you're quite happy to walk on the people in front of you so that you can get to the world and change it. Of course, if you then try and say about changing yourself, it becomes solipsistic, the metaphor, if you're not careful. It's all about my mental states. So all these metaphors have to be, they correct each other. But when we say changing the world, primarily what we mean is through Dharma friendship. By Dharma friendship, I mean friendship that's arising out of your ordination, which is different from mates. It's different from catch-up groups or whatever. It's friendship arising out of your ordination, which means, yes, encouragement, friendship, love, but it'll also mean challenge, and it nearly always means mess, some degree of mess. Yeah. Our culture and vision is a very messy one in a certain sense, inasmuch as we offer friendship right away, straight away. Yeah. So that I can be teaching on Wednesday night, and if somebody comes and talks to me, I can say, let's go for a coffee and chat more about that, because we haven't got enough time now. And I've done that again and again and again. So often there I am in my room, talking to somebody that I hardly know about very deep matters. And that's coming right out of my shared understanding of what I did when I got ordained. That it was a friendship. And I learnt that from Subhuti, I learnt that from Suvadra, he learnt that from Bhante. That it's about friendship primarily. If you're in another group, a Tibetan group, for instance, you won't meet the teacher. They certainly won't be hanging around at the tea break. Our tradition is that we get to know each other in very, very multifaceted ways, which is messy and problematic, because there's always a period where you feel inspired by teachers, especially when you don't know them very well. It's amazing, actually, how gullible people can be to confidence even to false confidence, I've noticed. People can be very, very taken in by false confidence. And some people are good at being confident, like temperamentally good at it. I feel a bit more like Yondaya. I can be overconfident and underconfident. I can never quite get it right. Someone like Subhuti is temperamentally confident. You know, even whatever he talks about, he's temperamentally confident about it. Some people are temperamentally underconfident. But yeah, I'm struck by how gullible sometimes people can be. So our tradition is about getting to know your teacher, the person that happened to teach you that class, in multifaceted ways. Like I probably taught Vidyadharka's. Well, I know I taught his first classes because I was leading the Wednesday class there. He's now just to become a private preceptor. Recently, when he was supporting the course that I was ordaining some friends on, we all went up to the shrine together. And I'd literally forgotten I'd ordained him for a minute. I thought, why is he coming up with us? Oh yeah, I ordained. It seemed such a long time ago that now if you were to meet us, you wouldn't know who ordained who. We're just friends. The fact that I ordained him has now, I don't know, disappeared back into friendship. So that somebody like Sean, an Irish-Belgian guy that I've recently met coming along, you know, we're already becoming friends, you know, and that you know, there's an awareness of me being a teacher, and gradually that will dissolve. And who knows? Perhaps I might ordain him. Perhaps I won't. Perhaps he'll disappear. Then at the other end, I've got someone like Vidyadharka, who I first taught newcomers, and now the fact that I taught him at the beginning and ordained him, all that has dissolved back into friendship. Mark said, "All things solid dissolve into air," which I think he references Shakespeare in that. And for us, all things spiritual dissolve back into friendship. Yeah. Aryadasa, giving a talk recently, was talking about his friendship with Bodhi Naga, who hopefully will come and join us. And you know that Bodhi Naga's just become his Kalyana Mitra, hasn't he? And then gradually the formality of that dissolves back into friendship, into Dharma friendship. Important to put that word with it, I think. So that what we call teaching in a public centre is one of the ways in which we do that. The reason we have public centres is to maximise the spread of Kalyana Mitra. That's Subhuti's phrase, I think, is to maximise the spread of the Kalyana Mitra. Otherwise we wouldn't have centres. That's what they're for. And by Kalyana Mitra I mean sharing in our shared understanding of Bhante's understanding of the Buddha. Yeah? And we're trying to maximise that for as many people as possible. And we need as many people as possible to come through our doors, because only the minority of those people will be ordained. One of the big issues for many centres at the moment is they're not getting enough people through their doors, which is, given the fact that Buddhism has never been so available. Secular mindfulness has meant that Buddhism is on everybody's lips at the moment. And there are real opportunities in that and there are real dangers in that. But it's incredibly culturally available. Our Buddhist centres should be heaving at the moment. Presidents should be saying to chairs, no, you're actually expanding too fast. You need to be careful of that. Actually, a lot of our centres, from what I've seen at least, are still very small, even after sometimes quite a long time. So if we're going to share ordination, it's no good trying to share it with 6 people who come along one evening, because the nature of commitment is rare. The nature of commitment to a spiritual, bad word, religious, bad word, mystical, sacred, whatever we want to use, some unknowable and some undefinable spirit is very, very rare. So if we're going to create a living spiritual community, which is what the world really needs, we need to think really quite hard-headedly about getting lots of people through the doors, and at the moment there's no excuse. When I first came along, long after Ratnaguna, but when I first came along, it was really fairly unheard of, Buddhism. You just didn't hear, you heard of the Dalai Lama and that's about it. It was really quite unknown, and there weren't any books on Buddhism, hardly, apart from Bhante's books. For instance, we never talked about Bhante's perspective or Bhante's elucidation of the Dharma because you just didn't see anything else. Unfortunately, we now have to highlight that, but I do think that's unfortunate. We used to look through that to that shared culture without realising it. It's a shame we can't do that now. We have to sort of keep on talking about Bhante's elucidation as if he's got some weird, quirky, English eccentric, possibly gay, possibly, tooting-based vision of the Dharma. And I think that's because of the changing history. We never used to see Bhante almost. We just looked through to the Buddhist tradition. And that's really what we want, really. Part of the issues around Bhante is that we've had to start saying Bhante's elucidation. We never said that, did we, in the old days? Nobody mentioned that. It was just the Dharma. And that's what it is. It's not some highly eccentric, slightly wibbly-wobbly account of it. It's a genius vision of it, make no mistake. Our teaching is really a communication of our ordination vows. So it's to do with friendship. So this is one of the issues of if possible, I want to put this carefully, but just watch out for having too many visiting teachers at your centre. Really great. Ratnaguna has been visiting a lot of centres. Really, really good to do. But some centres start to rely on it. The problem with that is the metaphor of that. Because Ratnaguna, when he just goes to Amsterdam or he goes to Ghent, he can't say, and yes, let's meet for a coffee tomorrow. He might say, let's have a Skype call. But when you're teaching, you're immediately saying, I'm in relationship with you, and we can carry on this. It's not really about me sitting up front telling you stuff, because that's easy peasy, especially if you're an extroverted show-off like me. It gets easy for a certain typology. For introverts, it's more difficult usually. Although introverts can get weirdly, eccentrically extrovert when they teach. I've noticed on occasion you just think, whoa! It's very odd. Anyway, try not to do that. The problem with visiting teachers is because it's just, you can't follow on those friendships. And how people grow is to do with teaching, yes, but it's teaching in a whole culture, and I mean that in the richest, deepest term. Culture comes from the word turning the soil, doesn't it? A cultivated land. What a centre is a patch of cultivated land where things can grow. And that's to do with how you welcome people at the door, how you set up the shrine room, how you meet with somebody for a coffee the next Wednesday to chat more about their question. All of that's part of our culture, yeah. So that's in a way the main thing I want to say, I think. That our teaching at St. I will make a few more little points to finish with, but the main body I want to say is that everything we're doing is to do with our ordination. Our ordination comes from Bhante's exquisite understanding of the Buddhist tradition. We can't hope to do that. What we can hope to do is share in that. We can't share that unless we understand it. Understanding Bhante is much more difficult than it looks. I don't know whether you've ever done this, but Vidyadhaka did it recently and I was really struck by it, where you read one of Bhante's talks and you just think, well, that's just fantastic. I'm just going to give my talk basically re-giving that. Do not do that, because what usually happens is you try and give it and you realise you actually don't understand it. It's a really weird experience, because you read it and go, really straightforward, really clear, everyone will get that, no problem, I'll just do that. You do it and you have this, I don't know what I'm talking about. It's a horrible feeling of shifting ground. Bhante's writing style is so actually beautifully clear that you don't realise how much thought is in it. Until you either, like me, try and say, okay, first stage, integration. Integration is, what does he mean by it? That word integration. And then you find in one seminar he says this, another seminar says that, and actually the more you go into it, it's horizontal and vertical integration, and golly, it's nothing to do with, psychological integration. It's a bit to do with psychological integration, but golly, it goes much, much deeper. Almost any term Bhante uses, if you follow it, goes right into something you can hardly express. But it's written so straightforwardly, you really think you've got it. So what's one of the issues of studying Bhante is that you can think you understand much more than you do. And that really shows up if you try and teach, and it really shows up if you try and write. So you need to understand Bhante's Dharma very deeply. Primarily, I think that's through catching it from your friends. But they need to be, in our new culture, our culture's breaking up a bit. That's my great concern, for our order in the movement at the moment is, if we're not careful, we'll lose our culture without us quite realising it. And we need to be preoccupied, constantly concerned to have our culture, so that somebody that comes to a class, you can say, let's have a coffee, and there's no off-limits areas. I'm just a friend, I'm not a counsellor, I'm not a professional, I'm not teaching professional mindfulness. I can just say, oh God, yeah, I can empathise. I can say, God, I'm a bit like that. What are we going to do about that? Gosh, that's a really good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Golly, I don't know how to answer that question. That's all part of our culture. It's also part of our culture to say, do you know, I really don't agree with that. I really don't agree with that. I can see why you think that, but I really don't agree with that. We need that kind of courage, yeah? Probably more than ever, I think. If we're not careful, we'll just fall back on mere encouragement, which can be a kind of passivity, I think. So yeah, our teaching is an expression of our ordination vows, in loyalty to our teachers, for the benefit of all being. It needs to be on the basis of the fact that we're trying to gain enlightenment. That's what we're really doing, if it's in tiny baby steps. It needs to be on the basis of harmony with friends and brethren. We're going to change that soon. Subhadramati and I are, with others, trying to come up with a new nomenclature. It needs our teaching is an expression of the ordination vows. So that's the main thing I want to say. I want to say one or two slightly more controversial points, just to finish with, about gender, which is very much the discussion of the day. Two things, gender, and I think in young people. So two things I want to say about gender. One is that we do need more women teaching up front. Yeah. We also need that seen more. It can be really odd. Subhadramati and I do a lot of teaching together. And sometimes people who even say, oh, it was great, Maitreyabandhu, when you said that. And it was Subhadramati who said that. Sometimes it seems like people don't always see that women are also leading. I'm afraid my experience is that it's often the women that don't see it. That's a starter for 10. I don't understand that. But it can be quite surprising sometimes when people are saying, I can't believe that you're leading again. And I say, yeah, but I did equal teaching with Subhadramati or whoever else I'm teaching with. And we're quite careful here, if we can, to teach with men and women. And often it's the women that haven't noticed it. Anyway, I'll leave that to the women to discuss. But what everybody needs is models, don't they? We need models of good women teaching. So even if you don't feel like teaching, just pause over that question for a moment. Can you... it's not everybody's cup of tea standing in front of a room, but it's fine. Mostly all you need to do is do it a lot, and before you know it, you've forgotten to be frightened about it. That's all it is. You'll be nervous at first, and if you're not, there's something problematic about it. And in a certain sense, you should always be a bit nervous, because you should be the Buddha. So it's a bit embarrassing that it's not the Buddha. Sorry about that, You should at least be Bhante, but, it's a bit embarrassing that you're not Bhante. So, it's me. You can have full confidence in that. Strangely, you can have full confidence in the fact that you shouldn't be teaching. So, okay, you can just be you then. You can't be the Buddha. You can't be Bhante. But many women have told me that they do want to see more women at the front, as it were. And I agree with that. So long as we're not doing that because they're women, they need to be, because they're ordained, they need to be arising out of, either getting ordained or arising out of taking those sacred principles deeply, deeply to heart and confessing shortcomings of that. That's why anyone should be teaching, because of ordination. But we do need that. Then secondly, the movement is not doing very well in terms of men. We're not doing too badly at the LBC. Even then it's always shifting, like the winter retreat. Until very recently could be at least, up to 3/4 women over men. We're often talking about that. Men book later, famously, for instance. So if you're not careful, a Vajrasana retreat will book up, and then the men won't book. Men won't change that necessarily. That might be just part of their structure, I don't know. I'll leave that for discussion. But generally speaking, men across the movement aren't doing very well. I was a while ago going to lead, launch the Journey and the Guide across Buddhist centres. The main things that struck me again was how old everybody was, frankly, and how few men there were. Sometimes, literally pitiable. I went to one centre where everybody seemed to me either as old as me or older. Most of them were women. Fine to have that, great to have that. I'm not arguing about, we want more and more men and women of all ages, etc. In this particular class, there were two very much older men, and somebody said, look, there's a young man, go and talk to him. He might have been 45. So I want us to keep on noticing that. Every opportunity I'm in, I'm trying to bring this to people's attention, because it really is a concern. It's actually part of a broader concern about young people generally. I've fairly recently become a public preceptor. I did that because I realised when I taught, that's what I'd forgotten. I realised when I first taught, when I came back and taught that Maitreyabandhu after a college meeting, I realised, oh no, because I don't want to be a public preceptor, frankly. I don't like sitting in meetings. And you get more flack for doing it. I remember teaching the Maitreyabandhu, and I thought, oh golly, that's why I have to be a public preceptor. Because the consequence, if I teach that, somehow all the consequences that meant at one point I need to become a public preceptor. Now you can only do that if you've been a private preceptor for 10 years. And at the moment, if you're then a private preceptor, you've been actually acting as a private preceptor for 5 years. So 15 years after your ordination, you can start thinking about that. Now, if we're ordaining people at my age, they're never going to be able to take on those responsibilities. And that's a real issue for the future of our movement. Recently, I went to an ordination retreat at Pamaloka. Most of the men on it were older than me. There was one or two younger. That's a real concern about the future. It's really good that we're doing young people's activities. It's really good that some of you here are doing that. For many of our centres, that still needs to be a priority. The reason we've got more young people here now than we used to have is we put a lot of effort into it and a lot of thought into it and took quite a lot of risks, actually. For instance, we got young people like Alex and Gus to do it without us. Now, there are problems with that, and I'm even now seeing problems in that, because one of the problems in that can be a sort of overconfidence, not in Alex and Gus, of course, and a sort of undermining of the ordination if you're not careful, as if I'm basically doing it and all I need is that white thing. And I've seen a little bit of that. But that's not as concerning. It's the risk, and we'll have to deal with that as we go on. But I think if we didn't give that project, originally the sub to 35 project, to Maitrey, who was under 35, it wouldn't have taken off. Otherwise, it's like building a skate park for people. Guess what? They don't want to do it. They don't want to go to that place at the South Bank, which they've used forever, which nobody built for them. No young person wants to feel patronised. I mean, we shouldn't patronise anyone, but it's a particularly embarrassing patronising young people. I remember doing a retreat in Pamaloka recently with a guy who's just been ordained. He's our youngest order member. He's 25, Dharma Kumara from Colchester. And he's got such a wonderful mind, very, very intelligent mind, a better mind than me. And I was really struck in my group. Everyone kept on saying, oh, yes, but you're young. I'm thinking, could you just answer the question, please, that you've just asked, rather than say he's young? You just mean actually, his questions were just better than most of the guys, yeah. But he was 25, so that was a bit threatening. It's a bit uncomfortable if you're 55 to have a 25-year-old ask a better question than you. But that's part of our culture, is to feel that, yeah. So those are the things I want to finish on, is the importance of women taking up roles in front of people. They take a lot of women in our movement take a lot of responsibility. Like Maitreyabandhu has just overseen the biggest building project in the history of our movement, by the biggest in terms of money at least, by far. Incredible thing to do. She doesn't tend to teach up front. She's doing a bit more of that now. But I'm not saying that women aren't taking responsibility in our movement. They are, remarkably. I just come back from the college meeting with incredible women who've taken responsibility since I was a boy, pretty much. Incredible. What I'm wanting to say there is women being willing to stand in front of the classes, basically. and ring the bell and say, okay, we're going to start. As soon as you do that, you've taken up more vividly the fact that you've taken ordination vows. And then I want to say that men aren't doing very well in our movement, pretty much across the board. I mean, in some places, not well at all. And that needs to be an issue for everyone, men as well as women. The women won't want a situation in which there are no men, especially young men, coming along. That won't be good. And I want to say that still a priority in terms of what our energy goes into needs to be young people. Otherwise, we'll become like the Catholic Church, where the public preceptors are in their 70s, the private preceptors in their 60s, and the people coming along are in their 50s. And that's not good for any of those people. You need the provocation of youth. You need its inspiration and energy to keep you on your toes, and for lots of other reasons. Okay, I think that'll do for just now. So let's leave it there, and let's see whether we want to have a few questions. But let's leave it there. Yeah. So we have got time if there is any. Just a few questions, yeah? Do you think?
15 minutes.
There's quite a lot to go into.
Yeah. I was really struck when you were talking about having to say this is Bante's elucidation of the Dharma, the way that you went to factor in the past. And I'm aware when I say it. And I guess I was thinking is how to move forward with that. I'm not sure you've got an answer, but I was just kind of thinking, because I am aware when I kind of a way of introducing Bante to people who may not have any idea of him, so that feels important. But then it does feel a little bit of a limiting thing to say, as if it is almost saying it's an interpretation.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
It
even can feel a bit clubby.
Yeah, and that feels uncomfortable. So I was just struck when you said that, whether there's anything there that...
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is I never say it in any public classes. It's mostly an issue for the order, actually, not for... I mean, lots of people don't know. I remember when I used to teach at Covent Garden, people didn't know. It's funny because they see you wearing a case, but they don't. They've come there for their reasons, not for anybody's elucidation of anything. They come there because they're stressed, because they're unhappy, because their partner's just left them. They're not in the slightest bit interested in what you are, really, apart from you, So you can have full confidence in that, that's my sense. You don't want to foreground that. It's mostly an issue for the order. I had an interesting experience recently where I was leading the Adhisthana retreat. Was it last year? I think so. Yeah. I lead it so often I can't remember when I was the winter retreat. And Bante was very ill, and he was taken to hospital on the pre-retreat. And of course, I was really concerned for Bante. I love Bante very much. So I decided, unusually, to leave the picture of Bante on the shrine, which I don't usually do for newcomers retreats, and I wouldn't recommend it. Again, because it highlights something that that's our issue, it's not theirs. If we're not careful, we're talking about our issues, including order issues. But actually, they're quite tertiary to life. And anyway, we had it on the shrine, and then before I knew it, I thought I really need to say something about why I got this picture of this guy, So I just said, I've just put this is our teacher, Bante Sangratchita. He's ill, he lives here. And so I wanted to leave the picture on the shrine. And then later on the retreat, I thought, I'll just say a bit more. So I told this story about when I went to this wildlife park with Bante in Birmingham. I can't remember what it's called. Anyway, we went to this wildlife park. We walked in, there was this huge cage of birds. And Bante was like enthralled. We went in and he walked straight across to it and stood there. I mean, I've never seen anything quite like it, like a 7-year-old, but, that time he was 80 or something, absolutely enthralled. He said, oh, yeah. He said, look at that. Oh, yes, very, very pretty. Oh, yeah, look. Oh, yeah. And we stood there for ages. And just being with Bhante, you could feel the birds so important to him, so soaking into him. I mean, it was quite exquisite. It was like being with a 7-year-old and St. Francis of Assisi. Oh, yes. And the delicacy with which he looked at them, was, you can't even impersonate it. Anyway, I saw this story. As I told the story, I noticed the whole room kind of wrapped with attention. And, and then that created this lovely atmosphere for the puja. So what struck me about that is people really need to know there's a living teacher. They really need that. But I also said in the team meeting, I remember, we mustn't talk about Bhante anymore. Because I think Sharad Siddhi then said something about Bhante after that. And I said, we mustn't talk about it anymore, because what they'll do is they'll go home and think, this is fantastic, search Sangharachta and what they'll find. And lo and behold, I got an email a few days later from somebody on that retreat saying, I've just looked up that guy, I'm leaving the movement. I said, how about we have a chat about it? And anyway, he came to my room and we talked about it. So I was really struck by meeting him, and he would say, well, here's it. And I was talking to him, and I had that conversation very, very much about Bhante's sex life or whatever. And what struck me about it is how difficult it is to know when to say that. I can't, what we do is that when someone becomes a mitra, they need to read the Triratna story. But there's so many issues in that, the issue of perfection and imperfection, the issue, all sorts of things which I can't possibly teach. So I think that is still an ongoing issue. If you see what I mean, that's all I'm doing is spending a long time agreeing with you. The main thing is that we've tried to do is introduce it when you become a mitra. That's really when you need to say, now you need to know all this. At the same time, you need to say, and I don't actually know. I've had so many discussions with people, and all I end up with saying is, yep, there are definite questions. I wasn't around at the time. Some of it doesn't sound very good. I also know Bhante fairly well, and can imagine there's different sides of the story. But the stories I hear, they don't sound very good. But mostly that's an order issue, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question. It's just one thing you said, something like what you're really trying to do is invite people into our community.
Yeah.
But you don't say that.
Yeah.
But I just wondered at a certain point, actually, if it's quite good to say that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
To actually make it explicit.
Yeah.
You can become an order member.
Yes.
Or you can become a mitra, and actually just make not being too actually. Or sort of signposting that as a possibility.
Yeah. No, I think we could have more confidence in that. I think mostly it's carried with you. I mean, most of our values aren't said; they're carried with you. They come through you, don't they? Just the fact how you'll listen to someone sometimes carries with you all sorts of views and values. Like I was saying about your idea to get people to email you if they couldn't come to the class. So much is carried with that you've been getting people in Dublin, if they're doing a Life of Full Attention course, to email, because you were leading the class, weren't you, if they weren't coming. What I was struck by that is that you see how that shows that I'm not teaching a subject, so you missed week 3 on medieval history. I'm teaching you. So if you're not there, I'd like to know you're not coming, and I'll tell the class you're not coming. It's made a huge effect to. It makes a massive effect to attendance. But what struck me most about it, in that little thing, carries lots of our value and culture. Most of our values and culture are carried with us, which is why we need to be steeped in it. Otherwise, we'll be carrying other views and values. But I think we need to be more explicit about, the stages, the symbolic stages of our journey. So, for instance, when I teach Life Full Attention, I teach spiritual death. I explicitly say, in our tradition, mostly where we teach this and explore this is when you get ordained. This is where we're now getting onto areas that is what you really dedicate yourself when you're ordained. And that's why, and I think we could be doing that more consciously, without any sense of pressure and all that stuff.
I think the reason I asked the question was I think some people have this sort of unconscious assumption that I could never do that.
Oh yes, that's right.
I think that's why I asked
Yes, that's right. That's right.
And some people even have been around for ages. They're like,
Yeah.
I think being an order member.
Yes, that's right.
And they've got this idea about themselves.
Yeah,
that
that's
something
right.
You almost need to explicitly kind of challenge.
Yeah, that's right. Some centres do why ask for ordination days, don't they? Things like that. Right, come on, I was going to do a retreat on that in India. Alex, you perhaps one.
I was really struck by what you said about kind of offering this hand of friendship. You know, I just know from running this sub-25 group that I've been doing a lot of that. I find it really rewarding and enriching that, you know, it's growing, and so it's the teams. There'll be other people to offer the hand of friendship, but it is also quite exhausting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Tell me about it.
Like meeting, like there's been some days where I've realised that actually meeting 3 people a day for cups of tea is a bit too much for me.
Yeah.
So I just wanted, I'm just forever impressed with the amount of people you meet with. I just wondered if you had any advice about, you know, because you don't want to then just, I found I don't just want to meet everybody that I possibly could in the class.
Yeah.
How about tea? How about
Yeah.
and then I meet loads of people tea. Some of them I'm not really listening to because I'm exhausted. And I don't know how to manage that or share it, or I don't know if you have any advice about that.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I mean, what I keep thinking is saying, Maitreyabandhu, you've got far too much ornament, you cannot see anybody else. Do not suggest to meet someone. Do not suggest it. Do not. You know, then I'm in a Mitra group or a teaching and someone says something and I find myself saying, well, why don't we meet and talk about it more? It's like something is drawn out of you sometimes, isn't it? Now, you do have to be circumspect about that, but sometimes you just can't. I find I can't stop myself. That there's something in them. Sometimes it's quite particular. You suddenly see something in them, and you want to say, "Don't worry, you've got it. Yes, yes to you, yes." And if need be, I'll chat to you to somehow say yes. I remember doing a group on a winter retreat again, and there was one man in the group going back to that issue, and he was very working class. He had a very bad alcoholic past, and his language was very, you know, he wasn't very eloquent, if you mean. But I really thought he had something. And the trouble is, of course, it comes from a very white working class background. He was quite sexist, and I don't think he was racist, but at least a bit sexist in the old-fashioned way, you know, where you say, I don't know, I can't remember what he said. And some of the women in the group were telling him off. And I wanted to say, you're all right. You've got it. Don't worry. Don't worry about the language thing. Don't worry about feeling like you don't. You've got it. There's something there, definitely. And it was I got a letter from his parents when he went back, because he went back into rehab and had another relapse. And his parents were just saying how much happier he was for the retreat. And I wish if he'd been here, I definitely would have, even if I was full of people that I'm meeting, I wouldn't have been able to stop myself saying, look, tell you what, let's have a chat about that later. You and me, we'll just go and have a coffee. How you get yourself not to, I don't know. Some people manage it. I've never been very good at that. But I think I needed to be better, because sometimes I spread myself far too thin. And I've got that danger. Some people, frankly, are not spread thin enough. I need to do a bit of spreading, wouldn't be a bad thing. I tend to be the other direction, I think. Because if you're not careful, you start meeting people, but you haven't got your own inspiration, so you haven't got much to give them. Perhaps one more quick one before we finish.
There's a question about, there's so many interpretations of Bhante saying from one's particular subject. And then our inspiration or the ordination is a mystery. And so what are we communicating?
Well, are we communicating? Yeah, indeed.
When we go up there.
Yeah.
Go up, in front of people. What?
I mean, the answer...
I feel confused.
I bet you do, yeah.
I feel confused.
In a certain sense, the answer is simple, at least in theory. You're basically always trying to communicate karma nirma and dharma nirma, to use that language. All the time, you're trying to say, there is, you may never say these words, but there is a sort of structure to the universe that prefers goodness, that prefers truth, that prefers the Dharma, that prefers the good. And that the universe is structured in such a way that if you act out of unskillful mental states, difficult things will arise. If you act out of skillful mental states, a new consciousness will arise. And then you're teaching, so that's the first great thing you're teaching, but we're calling it the mindfulness of breathing. And golly, at the end of it, people say, God, I felt... Sometimes someone's just saying at my chapter last night that he said, I don't know what was happening at the lunchtime class on Wednesday, but everybody came out feeling really kind of glowing. That's karma nirma. Because instead of going to the pub at lunchtime, or instead of having an argument with someone, you sat in a room and tried to watch your breath, you've done something skillful along the lines of karma nirma, and a new consciousness has arisen. And then on the basis of that, you're saying, and if you do that, you're something beyond you, but not separate from you, has got the capacity to shine through you. What you call Dharma nirma process is a terribly technical way of putting it, but there is something more that can shine you through you, more than egotism, more than your egotism, more than theirs. So that's what you're primarily doing, is giving people a taste of the Dharma life. It's not about teaching mindfulness of breathing and Maitreyabandhu, although it's valuable, all of the years, but primarily you're trying to give people a taste of the Dharma life, which means showing them karma and Dharma nirma. That's what we've got to offer. That's what we are sharing with Bhante. Yeah? And it's what Bhante is sharing with the Buddhist tradition. He's done both. You can't do karma nirma, you can't do Dharma nirma. Dharma nirma is what's come through when you do the work. It's analogous to the artistic experience when you do all the work, and inspiration sometimes comes through that. But you can't do the inspiration. But that's what you're doing, always what you're doing, whatever it is trying to teach karma nirma on the basis of that, the possibility of the arising of the Dharma nirma. As long as you know that, everything, you can just relax. That's all you're trying to do. And you're trying to have them meet a member of the spiritual community, because that's what they're really trying to do.